Across the country, AM 1450. Jim Bresnahan, now joined by Chris Graham of the Augusta Free Press. A weekend review from the news standpoint. A lot of this news still ongoing, of course. The Virginia General Assembly session, as far as the original schedule was concerned, was scheduled to adjourn this weekend on Saturday. We'll see if that happens or not, because last report, the House and the Senate still pretty far apart on a lot of issues, a lot of areas of the budget, and I guess we'll see what happens either later today or perhaps at the end of the weekend, Chris, whether the session wraps up on time on Saturday, whether they just walk away without a new budget, kind of going with the existing budget, or whether they'll stick around maybe Sunday into next week, perhaps in overtime.
Yeah, all those options you laid out there are what they could do, and this is a year, because Virginia does a 2-year budget, this is not a year where they actually have to pass a new budget. They're really just amending the ongoing 2-year budget, so there's no requirement that they actually come up with a new budget. And so if they don't, that's certainly an option for them. I think you'll see at least some efforts in the next couple of days to see if they can come to an agreement. Just because they're a 2-year budget is kind of interesting anyway, in a sense. Virginia has this interesting system where we have a part-time legislature, and they're only in session 45 days one year, 60 days the other year. And this budget year, I guess, this second year of a 2-year budget cycle gives you that flexibility to amend things that you couldn't have foreseen a year ago.
And who knows, maybe they just need a cooling off session, because I know they're going back in April for the veto session, for a special session on redistricting, so I suppose they could put it off for about a month and a half, whatever the actual time frame is, and you just go back and deal with the budget maybe in April.
They could do that too. That's right. I think that there's incentive. We've been talking about this, on a regular basis since before the session started back in December when we were previewing. That there's another incentive for them not to necessarily let this linger on too much longer, because this is an election year, and this year is one of those election years for all 140 members of the House of Delegates and the state Senate. So, the longer this lingers on, the less time those men and women who are running for re-election have time to really get into their re-election battle. So I think that there's incentive for them to get it done soon, but that's me saying that. These are two deliberative bodies that have their own different interests. Republicans and Democrats, even in the respective chambers, are different from each other because of their different approaches to things. So it's hard to get everybody around one particular piece and one particular approach to legislation. I can understand that. So I would think if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen this weekend. I mean, I really think that, and if maybe it has to go into a little bit of overtime, maybe into Monday or Tuesday, but I think that these men and women want to get this work done and get back to their districts and get starting to think about November.
You're talking with Beck Klein, with Cree Deeds, with Emmett Hager all the last few weeks. It just seems there are obviously a lot of areas of the budget where we see big differences between the House and the Senate, but education funding is right up there along with transportation funding.
Well, the transportation funding has gotten a lot of attention, certainly from the media and the groups that are out there on all sides of the issue there. And the transportation funding has been something that has been discussed at length for several years in Virginia. The last 2 governors before Bob McDonnell were Democrats, and they were trying to cajole the General Assembly into providing more funding for transportation projects. Here we are with basically now our 3rd governor in our transportation crisis, at least as far as some people portray it. And Bob McDonnell's having no more success as a Republican, leading essentially the Republican House of Delegates along the line here, and that's been the main thing. The governors have been in a different approach than the House of Delegates, and the Republicans in the House of Delegates have been saying basically we don't want to see any new taxes, but we also are not as happy with the idea that we can't be doing things out there. So it's kind of hard. You have to have some resources to be able to do things in transportation, and that's where Virginia's been kind of stuck for about the last 10 years or so. Education funding gets held hostage every so often just because we have so many other needs. Education funding is such a big part of the budget that if you can make just a sliver of cuts in education, then maybe you can make up some differences elsewhere. So education funding, of course, is always a hot button topic because it's such an emotional issue. And of
course, a lot of state lawmakers are not Not all, but there's a few out there that probably are not remiss about not raising taxes and leaving the localities pretty much in the hole where they have to raise taxes, but then they can go back to their constituents because this, again, is an election year for the House and the Senate and say, hey, we didn't raise taxes.
Yeah, and that's been an issue, I know, in Virginia. I've been covering Virginia politics for 15 years, and I've been hearing that consistently for about 15 years from local elected officials that the state officials have been putting more and more and more burden on them, and they have nowhere else to go but to the taxpayers, the local taxpayers.
And usually that means the real estate tax.
It means a real estate tax and or, the weird thing is you see pressure on the real estate tax to creep upward, and then still reduce services because you can't keep passing on all the cuts from Richmond and Washington to the taxpayers. So not only are you then cutting services then, but you're actually charging them more for reduced services. And so, but yeah, the average state legislator, the delegate or senator can come back home and say, I didn't raise your taxes, and the average voter out there is not that knowledgeable maybe about who's doing what to whom. Basically, they just know that, hey, when I'm here I don't get as much service, but at least I'm not paying any more taxes for it. Well, you have to look at it a few different ways before you can figure that out. And I think what state legislators hope for is that they can give you that soundbite that we didn't raise your taxes, and that you'll reward them appropriately.
Yeah, of course, that really upsets, as you mentioned, government officials, city councils, supervisors, and school boards, too.
Yeah, because just like at the state level and at the, with the federal level, it's not quite as big of a chunk of the pie, but at the local level, the biggest chunk of the local government dollar goes towards education. It's close to 50%, in some areas a little bit more than 50% of overall local spending is on education. And so when cuts come down from D.C. and Richmond again to the local level in education, that's just a tough area to deal with because that's where the rubber meets the road. Again, you can't there's nowhere for local government to pass the buck to. There's nobody else to pass the buck to except to the citizens who pay taxes and those who get services. And kids in public schools are among the most vulnerable, certainly, as far as people who deal with government on a regular basis. And you don't even think about that, but that is a government service. So yeah, that's a huge issue, and we've seen it. It's not as much here in Virginia as we've seen elsewhere, but certainly a real hot button topic right now is public education and funding for that.
And maybe we'll see how things go in this 2011 General Assembly session, how it all concludes, I guess, in the coming months. But, a guy who's been in the news here the last couple of weeks now, Governor Bob McDonnell, not just for the ongoing General Assembly session, but also his discussion about the idea maybe next year, if he's offered the VP slot by whoever is the eventual Republican presidential nominee, that he would not be against perhaps being on the ticket.
Yeah, he said that in an interview with NBC 12 in Richmond late last week, and it's the first time he's acknowledged publicly that he would be interested at all in considering a run for vice president. Of course, there's a lot of appearance there that he would be a very attractive vice presidential candidate. One, Virginia switched for the first time in 44 years from Republican voting for president in 2008, giving its electoral votes to Barack Obama. And so if Republicans are being strategic, hey, here's a chance, a guy who was elected with near 60% of the vote after Obama won Virginia, to put on your national ticket, that might put Virginia into the Republican column, which is Virginia's a swing state these days, so that could be an important consideration. Also, he's a Republican governor who seems like he has a national profile. Just in general, he seems to be well regarded by his peers, at the state house level, so to speak, across the country. And so there's a couple of things about Obama. He's a young guy, photogenic, well-spoken man, and so there's a lot of things that would make him very appealing as a vice presidential candidate. But it's interesting, of course, Tim Kaine in 2008 had a lot of the things working for him in the same way when Barack Obama was considering vice presidential nominees. And in fact, Tim Kaine was on the short list. He was on the top 3 or 4 of Barack Obama's potential vice presidential running mates. And I remember Republicans were very critical of Tim Kaine for even considering it back then, and of course now Democrats are being very critical of Bob McDonnell for a year out, considering that what happens happens. But if he's interested, they're saying that, hey, you're abdicating your responsibilities. You ran for a term and you're supposed to serve the people of Virginia. It goes all ways. Even dating back 20 years ago when Doug Wilder, when he was governor of Virginia, made a aborted run for the Democratic presidential nomination. He was criticized for that too. So it's interesting how these issues come up, and they've been out there for years, and both sides kind of engage in the why don't you think about Virginia first kind of motif.
Bob McDonald also this week has chimed in on the Wisconsin situation. Now, I'm not sure. I know we talked about this on the show earlier this week on our political hour on Wednesday. That I'm not sure we're ever going to see what's happening in Wisconsin happen in Virginia because they're two different situations as far as unions are concerned.
Yeah, in Virginia, it's a right-to-work state, and it makes it tough for unions to organize. Not that unions are barred in Virginia from organizing, just that, things like the fact that people can benefit from the work of the union without joining the union makes it, it's kind of a disincentive for unions to even get going too much in Virginia. So Virginia is a different state than Wisconsin in that sense. And actually, the governor in Wisconsin, Scott Walker, is trying to kind of push things in that direction, and essentially make Wisconsin a right-to-work state, at least in that sense. And plus, we're fortunately in Virginia, our legislatures and our last two governors have dealt with the budget issue very well. We're not facing a $3.5 billion budget shortfall like they're facing in Wisconsin. And so our state's been managed pretty well. The transition from Tim Kaine to Bob McDonnell and the transition of the last few General Assemblies, they've done a good job in managing our budget. So we're not facing that pressure. At least, you could argue, I guess, there are people who are closer to that situation than I who argue that really it's not that budget deficit, the budget shortfall is pushing this, but rather that Scott Walker in Wisconsin is kind of using this to enact something that he said he wanted to enact when he was running for governor. So whatever the case may be, Bob McDonnell's entered that fray, at least just giving a comment saying that he supports Scott Walker and what he's doing, and of course. That sounds to me, again, like the guy, Bob McDonnell, who might be interested in running for vice president. That's the kind of thing that has nothing to do with Virginia at all. But if you're trying to, keep your profile up on the national stage, you make a comment about that. So just like with the vice presidential interest, he's getting criticized for kind of even inferring that he has any interest in talking about that issue. He's sticking his neck out there a little bit, getting criticized by Democrats, but I'm sure Republicans love him for going out there and kind of getting into the fray like that.
Okay, Chris Graham with the Augusta Free Press is our guest. Chris, anything else we look for in the coming days news-wise from the Augusta Free Press?
Well, we'll try to make sense of whatever happens with the end of the General Assembly session, if it does indeed end soon, like we kind of expect it will. So we'll see if we can get into that issue, and we'll see what else pops up. The local government budget season will begin soon as the state gets its numbers in. So we'll have to keep up with what the locals are doing as well.
That's again Chris Graham with the Augusta Free Press talking weekend review from a news standpoint, as well as obviously all that discussion about the 2011 General Assembly session. Back more of Online here on Classic Country, AM 1450 on this Friday morning, right after this.